The grand young men that were killed, when I saw the hunger strikes, when I saw what did they die for, I said, that morning, and I cried my heart out. I couldn't swallow an oath of allegiance to the King of England. Not today. Couldn't swallow it. I couldn't do it. Not for £1,000,000 could I do it. Not for all Ireland could I do it.
To one young volunteer from Clonlara in East Clare, the issues in 1922 were a lot less clear than they had been during the War of Independence.
Well, early on, of course, there was a lot of propaganda for and against it, and it was very hard to make up one's mind. I was very young, and we were depending on, I suppose, people like Collins and De Valera to enlighten us on the future of what the treaty meant. So I found it hard to make up my mind about it. But then, of course, there were all kinds of things said that was good for, for Michael Collins, was good enough for us, and so on. And I think gradually, when it was explained to us, most of us, I think in Dublin anyhow, began to support Collins. And especially when the opposition became rather violent and threatened that the Irish people had no right to do wrong and all this kind of thing.
The national dilemma over the treaty was complicated by the stature which De Valera enjoyed. On earlier visits to the United States and to London, he'd been heralded as an international statesman, and this only underlined the esteem in which he was held in Ireland. The Irish people certainly wanted peace, but many would not turn easily against their political champion. And many more were determined to support his anti-treaty position with something other than rhetoric.
There could have been, and probably would have been, heart-searching and possibly some isolated fighting over the question of the oath, which was something that stuck in the craw of, understandably, of Republicans. That's what they fought for, a republic, not subscribing to the House of Windsor. But there was no way that they would have had the civil war that they had without this enormous figure lending himself to them. In the month of March, for example, he was talking about wading through blood as he addressed huge gatherings of ardent, fervent young country lads with rifles.
Remember that the 1st Southern Division, commanded by Liam Lynch, had opposed the treaty within days of its signing, long before De Valera had made any, months before he'd made any of those speeches. So he stirred things up, he made things more awkward for Collins and the provisional government. He behaved in a most irresponsible manner, but there would have been trouble anyway by that stage, by March, when he made those speeches. There was going to be a conflict.
He gave leadership, I think, to a group of people at that time where leadership was required. And my father and my mother were part of that group of people who thought that Mr. De Valera was near enough to, or next to God.
The educated man, the professor, the president might have given leadership. Maybe it had reached the stage where so much was got that some place...
If he supported the treaty and stood by Collins that we'd have no civil war. Quite a number of my colleagues did go anti-treaty and took part in the Civil War, but I didn't lose respect for them because of that. I think they were misled. And I think most of them, I think, realised that afterwards, that they took the wrong side altogether.
Taking sides in the spring of 1922 often meant taking up arms. The violent tradition in Irish republicanism was again flexing its muscles, while politics and politicians became slowly marginalised. Some anti-treaty leaders even spoke openly about a military dictatorship.
The soldiers believed that they had done the fighting. They had freed Ireland. The politicians were civilians. They were, if you like, untrustworthy. Politics was a dirty game. the people didn't really know what the true interests of Ireland were. The people were enslaved. They had a slave mind. That's a real Republican catchphrase of that period and later. Sean McBride is very fond of it. We know better than the ordinary people what is good for Ireland because we have earned Irish freedom with our blood. Therefore,
pretending to have a government and pretending to have some right to rule the country, which they hadn't got. It implied that they were the only Republicans. And that they had some brand of patriotism that others hadn't got. But we who sided with the treaty were regarded as Republican, just as Republicans they were. But they abused the very name, the very word Republican was abused around that period.
They didn't know democracy. They were under British rule for 800 years, and they were coming to the end of that period of colonialism, and you know, it has to be said that the British had very little concept of democracy when they were talking about Ireland. So my father was brought up in an era where it was insurgency, it was resurrection, it was independence, you know, and inevitably democracy, as you and I know it, to what you wish to achieve in a revolutionary sense.
Ireland was now sliding rapidly towards war. Mass meetings addressed by military leaders replaced political gatherings. Dialogue had effectively been silenced.
Of course, it was natural and sensible, in the light of the history of Anglo-Irish relations, for Irish nationalists to distrust a British government, particularly a government headed by Lloyd George, the wiliest and most dishonest and treacherous and cunning of all British prime ministers. Of course, suspicion was natural, but in the light of what happened later, De Valera and the Republicans got it wrong.
I think that De Valera has enormous moral guilt on his hands. I think in later life he probably realised it. He did say to Joe McGrath that it is my considered opinion that in the fullness of time Michael Collins's reputation will go up and it'll be at my expense.
The situation together. He was active on several fronts, striking a deal with Northern Premier Sir James Craig to halt appalling sectarian murders in Belfast, pressing Lloyd George to accept Republican proposals on a draft constitution for the new state, and resisting Winston Churchill's demands that the situation in Ireland demanded bloodshed, which he felt in the first place ought to be Irish blood. Collins responded with political aplomb. He cobbled together an electoral pact with De Valera to present a joint panel of Sinn Féin candidates to the people in the election scheduled for June 1922. What Collins was trying to ensure was a vote free from intimidation or violence. If he got this, he believed, then the people's verdict would be very much in his favour. And overwhelmingly it was, to tear up his agreement with De Valera. The election results were a massive popular endorsement of the treaty, a majority of 4-1 in favour of the agreement. De Valera now knew that he was battling against a tidal wave of public opinion. Opposing the will of the people, he later admitted, is by far the greatest weakness of our cause. An already expulsion, an arch enemy of Irish republicanism. 2 Irish volunteers were captured at the scene. The British government responded furiously, demanding once more that action be taken against those who were opposing the implementation of the treaty. Ireland's provisional government, under the leadership of Arthur Griffith, finally decided to act. Griffith might well have done so earlier, but for the influence of Collins. Dublin's forecourts had been occupied by anti-treaty forces since mid-April. These men saw themselves as a symbol, the natural successors to the men and women of the 1916 Rising, who had seized the GPO in similar circumstances. Militarily, it was a cul-de-sac, but the Republicans, led by Rory O'Connor, were determined to make a defiant gesture of opposition to the provisional government and to the treaty. At 4:30 on the morning of June the 28th, Free State troops, using 2 field guns borrowed from the British, opened fire on the occupied buildings. Inside, the anti-treaty forces remained defiant, in some ways relieved that months of futile negotiations had finally brought Ireland back to war, albeit a war with itself.